It is 2022 and this is a review of the Olympus Em1x, and it's what I think of this camera and its uses in astrophotography. Now there are many other things that I use this camera for as well, so I will cover many other aspects, but those will be at the end of the video since my channel is mainly about astrophotography. Now in astrophotography, weight is actually kind of a big deal. Even though we're really not carrying our camera around, you gotta set it up, and if your equipment is heavy, it really does discourage you from doing astrophotography. So a light camera is really something that is desirable. Now, when this thing showed up, this is the box right here, I was honestly expecting it to be heavier, and I was just taking it apart. I was like, is everything gonna be in here? Because this was a used camera. I did not buy a brand new one. I actually now wish that I had bought this camera when it very first came out, which was I think 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago from this video. But this right here, this is my E1 box, okay? The box alone for the E1 is actually heavier than my E1X is. And that's without the batteries in it, of course. Actually, I think even with the batteries in it, it's kind of it's coming close, okay? You know, this has a lot of cardboard in it. There was a lot of parts within parts. But if you take all the batteries out of this camera, it's really not that much different in weight than an Em1 Mark II with the battery grip as well. And I have an Em1 Mark II and an Em1 Mark III. We're actually shooting on the Em1 Mark III this minute. But yeah, I always use the battery grips attached to the cameras, and that was actually really for a very simple reason. If you use the internal battery, then they're going to draw current from them. It creates heat, okay? This guy can actually run on either one battery or two, which is kind of a nice advantage. And I would encourage you to run without any batteries if you can, okay? You say, well, how do you run the camera? Well, it's pretty simple. The E1X has built into it right here a 5.5 millimeter barrel, 2.5 millimeter center pin. This is a 9 volt, 5 amp DC converter, all right? And with that, I can run the camera. And the nice thing about this is it's a much cleaner signal, it's very consistent, and also it doesn't generate any heat in the camera itself, because when you draw current from a battery, the battery is going to warm up. That's kind of one of the reasons why you can start one of these cameras at minus 20 degrees Celsius, and you can actually keep it running even if temperatures drop to like minus 30, and that's because the battery is generating enough heat that it can keep itself running. Now, it won't last very long when it's that cold, and that's kind of another reason why I like to use external power, is because, well, batteries are just very unreliable when things get cold. Although the batteries that Olympus makes, they're really good batteries. I'm very impressed with them. I've tried lots of other off-brand batteries, never had any success, and it's really worth buying the Olympus batteries. Now, there's one thing that this thing doesn't have, and I've actually kind of delayed doing a review on this camera for a very long time, hoping that Olympus would change this via firmware update, and that's that the camera doesn't have Starry Sky Autofocus. I don't know why they don't put that in there. They should have in the last 2.0 update, but yeah, it's not in here. It's still not in here. We were supposed to get it fall last year, at least that's what the rumors said, but yeah, it still hasn't shown up in this camera, and it's kind of the only thing that is a negatory to this camera. You know, if you want to buy a camera that's specifically for astrophotography, yeah, I'd probably get the Em1 Mark III, okay? That'd be kind of my initial recommendation. Now, I've already got an Em1 Mark III, but I still use this guy, and I actually do prefer to use this guy over my Em1 Mark III because it has less noise, but that is only when I hook this thing up to a telescope. And of course, the reason that I use the Em1X for anytime I'm attached to a telescope is because the Starry Sky Autofocus doesn't obviously interface with either my focusers or the manual focusing knob of this telescope, and so Starry Sky Autofocus is kind of useless, and therefore it's not an advantage to me at all. So yeah, the Em1X, it is my choice when I'm attaching this camera to a telescope. The LCD screen in this thing, it's exactly the same as any of the other Olympus cameras, so there's really no differences there. I will tell you this though, that the refresh rate of this camera, it feels just a tiny bit snappier. And I know that that's not too big of a deal when you're doing astrophotography, but when you are focusing, it kind of is a little bit of a plus. It makes the experience just a little bit more comfortable when you're focusing on a star. So this is a battery pack, and the specifications for both the Em1 Mark III, this is an Em1 Mark II, but the Em1x and the Em1 Mark III was that through the USB port, the C port here, we would be able to charge the internal camera batteries. And it does work. However, I'm going to warn you, okay? You got to have the exactly right type of USB cord, and you have to have the exact type of battery pack that Olympus supports. And those kinds of battery packs are few and far between, okay? I've got about 6 or 7 of these battery packs that I use for various different things. I plug them into any other accessory, they all work. Not one of them works with my Olympus cameras. So yeah, the USB thing to me is a little bit useless because there just aren't very many battery packs out there that have the exact amperage and voltage that this camera needs. Now, the reason for that is actually the motherboard. It is a limitation built into the motherboard. It doesn't really have anything to do with the firmware. It's not something Olympus could ever update. It's a limitation of the silica that runs this camera. And I blame that on Panasonic because Panasonic is the company who manufactures the logic boards for this camera and also the Em1 Mark II and the Em1 Mark III. Now that Olympus is owned by JIP, I really hope that they get somebody else to do their silica because I don't think Panasonic does a very good job. You know, these hurdles and loopholes that you have to jump through in order to get USB charging to work with the camera, in my opinion, is not usable. Now, Rob Trek has an excellent video out there, which I will link to, that will show you how to select the correct USB cord and the correct battery charger or battery pack to get your camera to run, and then it will work, okay? And I've been out doing astrophotography with him, and it certainly does work great. But for me, for now, what I prefer to use is my DC converter, and as you can see right now, it is actually charging both of these batteries, which is kind of a nifty feature, and it kind of makes this battery charger, which comes with the camera, kind of obsolete for me at least. Like I really don't use this thing very much. I use it for my Em1 Mark III and the Em1 Mark II, just because, you know, charging them in the camera is a bit of a pain, especially the battery grips. You gotta swap the batteries all the time because it will only charge the battery that's in the camera itself. It won't charge the battery grip camera or battery. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on power with these things and astrophotography. Now, if you do decide to charge this thing through the USB or to run it via USB, I would definitely recommend using the cable that comes with the camera, okay? It's a good high quality cable. It's fairly heavy duty. Any USB phone charger, when connected through this process, will work. It'll charge the camera or it'll keep it running. It won't charge it and keep it running at the same time, which is kind of one of those Panasonic, why did you do that to us kind of things. Now, I will warn you, as far as the weather sealing goes, when this is open or the 9-volt port right here is opened, your weather sealing is a little bit compromised, although it's not really too big of a deal since most of the time we're photographing on a clear night, not when it's raining. And astrophotography light pollution, of course, is a really big deal. Now, there's a company out there called STC, okay, and I have one of their very first generation. This is a multi-spectra filter. They also make a very interesting dual band filter, which I'd be curious to try myself. But these filters, of course, do fit into the Em1x. They say that they're compatible with the Em1 Mark II, which of course they'll be compatible with the Em1 Mark III, and they fit this guy too like a glove. You can actually see I've already got it in here now. And one more thing, if you use a clip-in light pollution filter, you've got to be really careful about dust on the filter itself. There is a great dust reduction system built into all Olympus cameras, has been since the first time they introduced a SLR type digital camera. But that will only protect you at the sensor level. If you're putting a piece of glass in front of that, make sure that that filter is clean. Now, your Em1x is actually going to come with these 2 little plastic clips. Make sure you keep these and don't lose them. I know the owner that had this camera before me, he had no idea what they were for. They're very handy. So here's what these 2 little clips are kind of used for. They're basically cable, it's like a cable management system. And you think about it, there's no other camera company out there that does this besides Olympus. But this guy right here, it clips into your shoulder strap, and it basically just gives us a hard point so that if there's any yanking going on, it's not going to rip it out of the actual port. Rather, it's going to the load's going to go on this portion of the camera, and that will kind of protect the camera, protect the ports from any damage that could happen, because, you know, let's face it, astrophotography, cable management is very, very important. And so these two little accessories are really nice things to have and a big bonus. With the USB cord, I could basically control the camera using something like Olympus Capture, and then of course the power cord meant that I had no issues with power. And as a matter of fact, you could even take the entire battery pack, case and everything out, and just leave it out of the camera if you wanted to lighten it up as much as possible. With the Em1x, Olympus went a long way into designing every single button so that they each have their own tactile feel. And I must say, as an astrophotographer, I could really appreciate this, because it means that when I'm fumbling and mumbling in the dark and I'm hunting for that particular button that I need to press in order to make that change, these are very easy to find, especially the ISO button. It's got that little gritty surface to it. I really appreciate that. The buttons that are on the back, each and every single one of them has its own kind of tactile feel. You can see the menu button here. It's got this deep recess, and that is very easy to find. This is a button I look for a lot in the dark. And then of course the navigation button over here I found was a lot easier to use in the dark. All right, I think I've done enough yabbering about this camera. Let's look at some pictures, and I've got 7 photos to show you. All right, the first picture I want to show you, this is the Flame and Horsehead Nebula. Now, this is a tough target because the dog star, which is kind of right in the middle of this picture, is a very, very bright star, and if your sensor doesn't have deep enough wells, it gets overwhelmed very quickly, and this star can kind of just blow out. And you can actually see it's kind of big in this picture, but still, I got a ton of detail. This camera really rendered some of the hydrogen quite well, even though this isn't a modified camera. None of my Olympus cameras are modified cameras. Now, this next image, this is actually a pretty easy target. It just takes a lot of focal length. I've only got 11 photographs to stack. It was getting kind of low in the sky when I started shooting it, plus there was a moon out. So yeah, I only got 11 pictures. They were about 4 minutes each, and stacked them together, and this is kind of what I got. Now this target right here, this is a target that having a non-modified camera won't hurt you in, you know, because galaxies are broadband targets. Most of them are really small, but this is M31, okay? This is a huge, huge target. It's also pretty bright, but it's kind of a little bit tough because the middle is bright, but the outer edges are really faint. And, you know, the sensor is doing a great job here. It's rendering those outside edges quite well. And I took this picture, by the way, in the city, all right? In my city backyard. I used ISO 200, I believe, and this is a stack of just 27 images, the 4 minutes each. You know, if I had done even more images, I probably could have gotten even more detail on this. And then this right here, this is when I went to a dark sky location for this. This is a stack of 50 images. 4 minutes each. This is taken at ISO 1600. At higher ISOs, you'll have less read noise than you will with lower ISOs, but you know, you have less dynamic range at higher ISOs. And by the way, I do have a video that's dedicated to which ISO to choose. You know, that's a separate video you can watch. I'll link to it below. And then this right here, this is M42, or the Orion Nebula. And this one I took in the city once again. You know, these are just 60-second exposures. There's 64 of them stacked here. And yeah, this is a great target to start on. You know, this is such a big and awesome target. This is a 522mm focal length. By the way, every single picture that I've shown you so far here has been taken with my 522mm focal length f6.3 scope. And then this picture right here, I actually took this with an Olympus lens. This is the 100 to 400 f5 to f6.3, and this one I did out in Bortle 4 sky. This is a much darker sky, and as you can see, there's a lot more detail in it. You can see some of the non-active hydrogen in the outer areas, and of course, you know, this is, and by the way, this is just 19 pictures stacked. You know, 19 4-minute exposures, whereas the previous one that I showed you, which I took in the city, you know, that was 64 pictures. So out in the country, you know, where there's less light pollution, you can do longer exposures without worrying about things getting blown out by the light pollution. And then this is the last image I want to show you. This is also a very tough image to get, you know, because this is a mainly dark nebula type photo. You can see there's some hydrogen on the left side. That's that dark purplish red. Should really render as red. If this was a modified camera, it would come out a lot stronger. But you know, you can see there's stars being birthed over here in the right, and the dust that's around them is not active dust. It's very much passive dust. It's just basically, only reason we can see it is because there's bright stars there to illuminate it. And this, once again, this is just 16 photos, 4 minutes each, stacked together using ASTAP. All of my images are stacked in ASTAP, and any one of these, if I just spent a little bit more time on them, you know, we could have made even much better images. Most people stop around 30 or 60 frames for a picture before they consider it finished. You know, and that, of course, is because, you know, I don't have too many nights when I can go out to a nice dark sky in the country and take images. So I'm kind of limited to just shooting here in the city. All right, now that I've summed up everything that I can think of about this camera when it comes to astrophotography, I want to talk to you about some of its other traits, which really don't pertain to astrophotography, but are things that you may want to consider if you want to buy this camera. Because I didn't buy this camera just for astrophotography. I mean, I needed it for a heavy-duty work camera, and also I like doing some wildlife, and boy, does this camera do well with wildlife, especially when you pair it with a big lens. But anyway, okay. Let me talk to you about something that every other reviewer has just completely glossed over, okay? That's the viewfinder, okay? The viewfinder in this camera is awesome, right? It really is. I was just on DP Review's website, and I was looking for a camera with a larger viewfinder than this guy. Now, I know there's at least one or two out there that are bigger, because I asked once in the forums, but they're all $6,000 plus cameras, okay? This is a $3,000 camera when it came out. Now it's like $1,500. Okay, but even the big heavyweights like the Nikon D3, the Sony A7s, even the new Z9 that Nikon just came out with, the R3 that Canon just came out with, the 1DXs that have been Canon's flagship cameras for so long, even those have smaller viewfinders than this guy right here. This is a 0.82x magnification, and it really is a great viewfinder. And I remember one of the Olympus engineers, when they were talking about this camera, they mentioned that I believe they used 2 ED glass lens elements in this viewfinder, and that is why it's got such a big field of view, and it's very comfortable to use especially for very long shooting sessions. Now, I know it's only got a 2.3 million dot LCD in here, which I'm sure that is something that will come out with a nicer one here in the next iteration of the camera. But you know, Olympus even said that, you know, they looked at other ones out there, but there just weren't any out there that had the refresh rate of this one. And I can't blame them too, because the refresh rate in this thing is flawless. I know a lot of people have been saying that the new Nikon Z9 is the first truly mirrorless camera, and I would kind of say that Olympus has really already beat them to that, because this viewfinder really has no blackout whatsoever, and its refresh rate is super fast. And because of the ED glass that's in this thing, it's very sharp, okay? Really bright highlights in the viewfinder. They don't show the chromatic aberration that I see in many other viewfinders. So really, a nice viewfinder to have. So that's something I've always had complaints with every single digital camera I've owned, is that the viewfinders are crap compared to my old Olympus OM film cameras of yesteryear. And this guy here, this is the closest thing I've seen yet to equaling the viewfinder in my OM1. And also, the cup that's around it, okay? This is a very comfortable cup to push your eye up against. I can't say that for any other Olympus cameras that I've ever owned. I know the Em1 Mark 1 and 2 and 3, all of them, they have this very small rubber cup that goes around the eye cup, and it is not comfortable to have that pressed up against your eye for long shooting sessions, especially when it's really bright outside and you want to get your eye as close as possible to it so you can kind of really see the image. This guy, much more comfortable to use, and this is a professional viewfinder, folks, okay? This is designed for long periods of use. All right, have I ranted long enough? I hope so, because nobody else out there ever mentioned this. Shame on all those reviewers. Okay, so let's talk about the ergonomics of this camera. I mean, everybody else mentions the ergonomics, and I really do like the ergonomics. I don't think they're absolutely perfect, but I'm not a guy who shoots vertical grip that often. But this vertical grip, it does feel great. I'd actually say that the vertical grip feels better than the landscape grip does, honestly. Now, right here, there's like a flat section, and I don't know why this is here because ergonomically it doesn't really make much sense to me. However, like after using it and thinking about it a lot, I don't think that it in any way hurts the ergonomics. I don't know, I would have to see it without this flat spot here. Maybe there are some electronics back here that are necessary, and that's why this had to be here. Yeah, I don't know. But the size of this thing, you know, this is a bigger camera, but I must say that this is a perfect fit for my hands. If this thing was any bigger, if this thing was any smaller, I don't think that the feel and the reach to all the buttons could really be any better. Now, hey, I could be wrong. Maybe Olympus could, you know, prove me wrong someday and make a camera that's a little bit smaller that has the great ergonomics that this does. But, you know, I've already talked about the buttons. I love the buttons. I love the way they lay out. And also, I love the speed of this camera, okay? Everything in this camera is faster, okay? Even navigating the menus just feels faster than any other camera, even my Em1 Mark III. This guy is faster in just every single respect. It's also got GPS. You know, there's actually a bunch of little features in this thing, and when you start navigating the menus in this thing, they do go deeper than any of the other Olympus cameras out there, because, you know, this was Olympus's flagship camera. It still is Olympus's flagship camera. Now, I'm in no way an expert in wildlife photography, but it's something I've kind of always had a little bit of passion for. I just know there's no money in it, so I'm not interested in going down that rabbit hole full time. But yeah, this camera, okay, it's got this bird detect system in it, and I imagine that Olympus will continue to add more species of animals, probably wildlife next, to this thing's autofocus algorithms. Now, I know some other people have complained a little bit that it's not 100% perfect, but the hit rate with the bird detect in this, it really is great, okay? It's well over 90%, that's for sure. There's just a couple things that will trip it up. Most of the time, the things that will trip this camera up is any foliage that's kind of in front of that object, or the bird, I should say. And the reason for that, okay, is because although this camera uses phase detect for its cross-type phase detect points, all right, when it switches to bird detect, it's kind of using a hybrid, almost in-between systems, where it is using contrast detect in order to detect the bird's eye, but it's also switching to that contrast detect in order to do autofocus, and that's kind of one of the reasons why it just can't get through the brush sometimes, because I've noticed that has kind of annoyed me a little bit. It's like, man, why can't it punch through that brush? I mean, it knows that the bird's there, it's locked onto it, it just won't focus there, and, you know, it's because it switches to contrast detection, and that is really something that's probably a limitation of the sensor. You know, Olympus has done as good a job as they probably can on the software side. I don't really know of any way to kind of get around that. It's just something that we need to wait for Olympus to come out with their next sensor in order to make the next big jump forward. Because really, folks, the intelligent AI that built into this camera for focus, you know, when it came out 3 years ago plus, it was really groundbreaking, and it really still is groundbreaking to this day. To get a camera like this, you know, you've got to spend upwards of $4,000 or more, okay? And I don't have that kind of money myself, so that's kind of one of the reasons why I stick with Olympus, you know, especially for birds and wildlife. Now, I have kind of noticed that the bird detect autofocus, it actually works on a lot of animals. So, you know, if you're at the zoo and, you know, give it a try, you know, because you may find that you actually get some good hits out of it. I know face detect doesn't really pick up animals very well. It really only works on human faces, and it's got to see the person's eyes. You know, if they got a hat and that comes down over their eyes, man, it loses it right away. And that's probably because it's using that contrast detect system in order to do that autofocus. Now, you're probably wondering a little bit, okay, what's the low light performance of this camera like? When I'm shooting birds, I actually feel comfortable shooting at ISO 3200, and occasionally I will even bump it up to ISO 6400. Now, I do not use any of the intelligent noise AI type technology that's out there, and I think it's DxO Photo Labs, and there's a couple other ones out there. But I know that with those algorithms, I mean, you can really push these cameras to their limit. You know, ISO 6400 is no problem for this. So if you're worried about high ISO performance, you know, it's $100 to buy the software that basically eliminates the noise in these images, and you know, just buy that, you know, and then use it up to 128, or what is it, 12,800 ISO. No problem. It's freezing out here, but we're out here in broad daylight, and this is kind of one of the other new features that's come out in both the EM1 Mark III and the EM1X. So not entirely exclusive to the EM1X, but the EM1X was the first camera to get this. That is the built-in neutral density filter, and the built-in neutral density feature has some interesting things about it. So you can actually program it so that the LCD screen will show you a preview of what's going on. Matter of fact, if I was to move this thing up and down, you'll see it just kind of blurs the whole image, and that's because it's actually building an image constantly and constantly refreshing it. Now, so just to refresh the image, you can actually just halfway press the shutter button, or you could do some focusing with the focusing ring and it'll go back to you know, a normal non-ND type view. But I really like the ND feature. I mean, it allows me to get that creamy, you know, waterfall kind of effect in broad daylight. I know we were going to come down here early in the morning, but you know, it's the holidays. We all slept in, so we're down here in broad daylight. But that's not a big deal because of the neutral density filter. All right, when you pair this thing up with Olympus's macro lens, man, the macro lens almost feels like a toy on this camera. The width of the camera, I have no problem with, okay? Getting a little bit wider, I think, is kind of something that was actually a little bit needed in order to make the ergonomics of this thing work. Now, there is one aspect of the dimensions of this camera, though, that I think could have been made smaller, and that is the height of it, okay? And the reason for the reason why the camera is the height that it is because of these batteries. They're set up on their side like so, and that just kind of forced the designers really to make the camera a little bit taller. Other than that, really this camera could have been a little bit shorter, and I think that would have kind of sidestepped some of the backlash a lot of people complain about the size of this camera. Now, as you all know, Olympus has patented a new battery. We'll see what it is. Maybe it will kind of sidestep this issue, and we will see a new EM1X that is smaller, which would be kind of cool. You know, to get this kind of ergonomics in a slightly shorter package is something that I would not be averse to at all. All right, let's talk a little bit about beauty, okay, and the presence that the E1X kind of tends to command when people see it, all right? Now, you look at the telescopes that are behind me, okay? The one that is the bigger white one, almost anyone who looks at that scope is going to immediately assume that that's the expensive one. You would be wrong, okay? The uglier, smaller one is actually the one that costs 5 times as much. Why that is, I could get into it in a lot of detail in another video, but this is about the E1X, okay? So, I don't think the E1X is one of the prettiest cameras Olympus has come out with recently. As a matter of fact, I don't think I know of anybody that would consider this a beautiful camera. But it's a workhorse camera, okay? It really is designed to be a tool. Now, the Olympus EM1, the Mark I, the Mark II, the Mark III, these I think were good looking cameras, okay? And as a matter of fact, just recently, I picked up the cult camera of this century, the Olympus Pen F, all right? And I have already had a whole bunch of people over at my house who, when they see this thing on the mantle of our fireplace, the first thing they ask is, does it take great pictures? It's beautiful. So it must take great pictures, right? You know, because I guess beautiful cameras sell, folks. So yeah, the E1X, it's not a beautiful camera, so I don't think that your customers are going to assume that you're going to take great pictures because of the beauty of this camera. However, because of the size of this camera, they will immediately assume that you are a professional and you know what you're doing. Which kind of brings up something. When I used the Olympus E1 back in the E1 days, I always had a battery grip on the camera. Why? Not because I needed it, not because I needed the extra battery life. I had a battery grip on the camera because that made you look like a professional, okay? If you came to a wedding with half of a camera, okay, in other words, a camera that didn't have a battery grip on it, people always questioned whether or not their camera was nicer than yours was, or Uncle Ned's camera was nicer than yours was. So, a built-in battery grip, it's kind of an essential thing if you want to be taken seriously as a professional. And this is kind of segue us into the next part where I kind of want to talk about the history of the designs of the professional cameras that Olympus has done, because I have always used my pro cameras with a battery grip So to me, the whole size thing, this is not the biggest camera that Olympus has ever made if you count the battery rips that were on the E1, the E3, and the E5. Now, when the Em1x came out, which is right there at the front, there was an enormous amount of surprising backlash from people who were kind of scared that Olympus was kind of departing from the whole idea of compact, small bodies. However, if you look through here, this is kind of the transition of the different professional cameras that Olympus has made throughout the years. I mean, it's not bigger, okay? It's actually still smaller than many of the other previous cameras. But let's kind of look at like where we've gone with technology in the years. You know, when digital came out, it was kind of promised us that cameras would get much smaller. This right here is the Olympus film camera that kind of ushered Olympus in as a major player in the camera industry and kept them there for a very, very long time, even though they, for all practical purposes, since the 1980s, deserted the system and really didn't develop it at all. But it was still, you know, a major player even when I first got into photography, which is why I grabbed an OM1 and started doing astrophotography with it. So this right here, this is typical today of a digital camera, is you'll see that using the same format, like you look at some of the latest Canon R cameras compared to some of the old AE1 cameras from the old film days, they're monstrous cameras compared to the old film cameras. So with all the like technology and the features and stuff that they pack into these cameras, there's just no avoiding it. They are going to get bigger, okay? And some of that size is necessary in order for us to have enough room for all these buttons, okay? This guy right here, I mean, he's actually covered in quite a few buttons, and if I was to try to throw all the buttons that are on this camera onto this camera, it really wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to make something ergonomic or useful. So check these two out right here. This is an Olympus OM1, and this was Olympus's first foray into a digital SLR. This is the E1, and I had two of these. I still have two of these actually. And as you can see, it is enormous. I know I had already been using the Olympus E10, which was kind of one of their semi-pro zoom lens reflex cameras, and it was actually quite a bit smaller than this. And when this camera came out, it actually wasn't a surprise to the industry. We'd already seen dummy mock-ups of this camera, and we already knew what the size was going to be. I didn't really know because I wasn't really paying attention, but when I bought the camera from Olympus, you know, I bought it with everything, and I got it, I was kind of like, this is really big. So the years kind of eked on, and I think the E1 was the flagship camera from Olympus for, good grief, close to 5 years. And it was actually really frustrating for me as a professional because the E1 had a 5 megapixel CCD sensor, and everybody else has switched over to CMOS sensors, and even their lowest end camera, this is an E410, had come out, and this had a 10 megapixel CMOS sensor, or live MOS as they like to call it. And this guy had a way better sensor than the pro level camera. Like they waited so long to update this guy. And then when the E3, which is this guy right here, finally came out, you know, it had a sensor in it that had already been out in the amateur camera for quite a while. So as a professional, it has been kind of frustrating throughout the years that Olympus would periodically and very often put higher end sensors in lower end cameras before updating their pro level equipment. And that, I think, is actually kind of one of the reasons why a lot of people got a little ticked with Olympus over the years. Now, this little camera right here, this is where things kind of changed. And I don't know if Olympus got a completely new design team or what, but they really stepped up the ball. And the 4/3 system never sold well, okay? You look in the used market, there aren't very many out there because there weren't very many sold, and they're actually kind of hard to find. And although I love the design of this E3, the ergonomics of it are fantastic, it is a monstrous camera. In fact, it is the biggest camera that Olympus ever made. So when the Em1 came out and I bought it, finally, I upgraded, I mean, it was a fantastic camera. It had the highest end sensor that Olympus offered at the time, which was great because, you know, that's the way it should be. The pro level camera should have the best technology. And it also kind of signaled a new phase, if you will, of design language, or maybe I should say philosophy. Take a look at these two right here. This is the this is the 8mm f3.5 fisheye lens that was used in the old 4/3 system. This guy over here is the 8mm fisheye lens in the current MFT system. Look at how much smaller this is compared to this guy. It's a gigantic difference. And on top of that, the old 4/3 8mm fisheye, it's very slow at f3.5. This new guy is the fastest fisheye there is right now. It's an f1.8. And it's really sharp, okay? This guy right here, the old 4/3 one, oh man, it was horrible, okay? It was a very fun lens to have. I totally don't regret spending the 800 bucks on it. But, you know, as far as the way it rendered stars, it was just, yeah, really bad. This guy I could just about use wide open, whereas this guy here, I mean, I had to stop it down to f5.6 before I could get pictures that I wasn't disgusted with. The last, like, 3 generations, actually, these 3 cameras, this represents my Em1 Mark III, which we're actually shooting the video with right now. But this guy, these two are almost completely identical, and I know a lot of people are kind of disappointed a little bit that the camera didn't change much, but I really liked the Em1 Mark II, and not only is it a fantastic camera, but, you know, the fact that they didn't change it is because it really wasn't a broken system. It was a great piece of equipment. I think maybe the only mistake that Olympus may have made with the E1X is that they made it a little bit bigger than the Mark II and the Mark III. Now, I love the ergonomics of this camera. I think it's a great, great camera. It fits perfectly, but maybe it could be a little bit smaller. And I think that's kind of one of the things that scared everybody a little bit. Everybody thought that, you know, they were making huge cameras and this was the biggest camera Olympus ever made. But, you know, if you compare it to the E3 here, you can see that this E1X is clearly not the largest camera that Olympus has ever made. Okay, the E3 and the E5 way beat the E1X. Okay, this guy is quite a bit smaller. And this kind of brings up another thing. I really wish the manufacturers, when they publish the sizes of their cameras, they would also publish the cubic millimeters of volume that their equipment is made up of. Because I think that would kind of help people truly appreciate the difference in size between a camera like this and a camera like this, because these two dimensionally they're kind of about the same width, they're kind of about the same height, but the thickness of this camera body compared to the E1X, just the amount of volume that the E1X takes is a lot less than the E3. And the last thing I want to talk about here when we talk about the design of these cameras is the viewfinder. Okay, I don't know why Olympus always gets the viewfinder wrong the first time. So this guy here, the Em1 Mark I, the viewfinder, oh man, it cuts your eyebrow. It's a nasty, uncomfortable viewfinder. It's very small, and I think that's what they were trying to do. In contrast, the E1 versus the E3, the E3 had a great viewfinder cup. It pops off really easy, and so, you know, I don't have mine anymore, but it was much more comfortable than the E1 eye cup. And also, the E3 viewfinder was way better. It was bigger, had a nicer field of view. Getting things in focus with it was much, much easier. When the E1X first came out, it was priced about twice as much as the E1 Mark II. And I think that the price tag was completely justified. In retrospect, I should have bought one right away. Now, if you look at the shutter of the E1 Mark II, it was rated for about 200,000 cycles. The E1X, however, is rated for about 400,000. I know when I'm considering the purchase of machining equipment for my machine shop, if a piece of equipment is rated to last twice as long and it costs twice as much, it's totally worth it for me to buy that equipment, even though it costs twice as much.
And also, a lot of people are just very happy with this camera. I've just never heard of a user who didn't like their E1X. Everybody just loves this camera that has it and uses it. And you also don't see very many of these on the used market. I was actually really fortunate to find one that was used. And that's kind of a very good indication that this is a camera that gets photographers and it keeps them, which is kind of exactly what Olympus needs.